The rain hammered against the windows of Dr. Adrian Cole's office in downtown Los Angeles, creating a rhythmic percussion that should have been soothing but felt ominous instead. Adrian sat in near darkness, only the glow of his computer screen illuminating his face. Files upon files of crime scene photographs, autopsy reports, and behavioral analyses lay scattered across his desk, the accumulated weight of 20 years studying the darkest corners of human psychology. At 47, he had built a reputation as perhaps the most respected forensic psychologist on the West Coast, consulted by the FBI, local police departments, and even private investigators desperate for insight into why people murdered other people with such careful calculation. But tonight, Adrian was afraid. Not of the criminals whose minds he dissected with clinical precision, but of something far more personal, the possibility that in studying monsters, he had become something monstrous himself. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. Cold now, forgotten for hours. The face of a victim stared back at him from the screen. Sarah Chen, 26, found in her apartment in West Hollywood 3 weeks ago. The murder bore striking similarities to a case from 1998, one of the most documented serial killings in American history. The precision was deliberate. Someone wanted Adrian to notice. The phone rang, jarring him from his spiraling thoughts. He checked the time. 11:47 p.m. Only one person called this late. "Tell me you're not at your office." Maya Thompson's voice was sharp, all business. But Adrian detected the underlying concern beneath her FBI investigator's composure. "I'm reviewing the Chen case," Adrian replied, not bothering with pleasantries. They'd worked together for 5 years now, and formality had fallen away somewhere between case number 3 and case number 47. "Adrian, you need to come in. Officially. We have another body, Denver this time. Same signature. We're setting up a task force and they're requesting you specifically." Adrian felt something shift in his chest. 2 murders mirroring famous cases wasn't coincidence. It was a message. "What's the connection?" "That's what we need you to tell us," Maya said. "There's a pattern, but we can't see it yet. You're the pattern guy." He hung up 20 minutes later after agreeing to fly to Denver in the morning. But Adrian didn't sleep. Instead, he found himself in the rabbit hole of true crime forums, reading through theories from amateur detectives who dissected murders like they were plotting television shows. This was America in 2025, a country obsessed with the mechanics of violence, where podcasts about serial killers topped streaming charts and documentary series about real crimes generated more conversation than most political debates. The public had an insatiable hunger to understand evil, to feel like they were solving mysteries from the safety of their homes. Adrian wondered, not for the first time, whether that collective fascination made the violence worse. Whether feeding the public's obsession with murderers somehow created more of them, or whether he himself, in his attempt to understand, was simply feeding his own darkest curiosities under the guise of scientific pursuit. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of amber and grey, Adrian sat on the edge of his bed, watching the city wake up. Somewhere out there, someone was following in the footsteps of documented killers. And somewhere in Adrian's own mind, a voice whispered that he understood why, not because he was a better investigator, but because some part of him, the part he'd spent years burying under degrees and professional distance, recognized something of himself in the darkness. He packed his bag mechanically, moving on autopilot. The archivist, as some online communities were already calling the killer, had made his interest clear. And Adrian Cole, whether he wanted it or not, had been chosen to play a role in this game. The question was whether he could investigate the killer's mind without losing himself in the process. The Denver field office was a controlled chaos of activity when Adrian arrived. Grey carpet, fluorescent lights, and the perpetual hum of urgency that characterized federal investigations. Maya met him at security, and Adrian was struck, as he always was, by the contradiction she embodied. Sharp, professional exterior, concealing deep emotional reservoirs she rarely allowed anyone to access. At 38, with blonde hair pulled into a practical ponytail and eyes that had seen too much, she looked simultaneously exhausted and intensely focused. The second victim is Derek Martinez, 32, software engineer from the tech district. Maya briefed him as they walked toward the conference room. Found in his home 4 days ago. The crime scene mirrors the Anthony Sowell case from Cleveland, 2009. Same staging, same degree of brutal efficiency, but here's where it gets strange. Martinez was known to be an amateur true crime podcast enthusiast. His entire apartment is filled with books about famous killers. Adrian felt that familiar sensation, the world narrowing into sharp focus, pattern recognition kicking into overdrive. 2 victims now, both with documented connections to true crime media, both murdered to mirror famous cases, both in different cities. This wasn't random violence, it was choreographed. The killer is auditing us, Adrian said quietly, more to himself than to Maya. The public obsession with true crime, with understanding killers. He's not just replicating murders. He's commenting on it. He's saying something. They descended into the basement conference room where the full task force had assembled. Adrian recognized most of them. Seasoned investigators, specialists in homicide, victimology experts. But the atmosphere was different than cases he'd worked before. There was a palpable anxiety here, a sense that they were being tested, that the killer held the advantage because he was orchestrating the narrative. Adrian spent the next 6 hours in that room, moving through the evidence with methodical intensity. Crime scene photographs, witness statements, behavioral profiles, and slowly, terrifyingly, something emerged. The victims weren't random. They were chosen because they represented something specific in the killer's taxonomy of American violence. The first victim, Sarah Chen, matched the profile of killer's early victims, young, vulnerable, chosen for proximity and opportunity. The second victim, Derek Martinez, matched the profile of later victims, someone with connection to the killer's obsession, someone who understood the psychology of murder at an intellectual level. "He's writing a book," Adrian said suddenly, looking up from his notes. "Not physically, but he's creating a narrative. Each murder is a chapter, each victim a data point, and the narrative has an audience, us, the investigators, the media, the public consuming this as entertainment." Maya leaned forward. "What's the end game?" Adrian met her eyes, and for a moment the professional distance between them flickered. He saw her fear, her determination, and something else, a recognition that they were both trapped in something larger than themselves. "That's what terrifies me," Adrian admitted. "The endgame depends on his purpose, and I'm beginning to suspect his purpose is personal. This feels directed. It feels like he's building towards something specific, and we're all just players in his design." That evening, alone in his hotel room, Adrian couldn't shake the sensation that something fundamental had shifted. The cases he'd studied before had always maintained a clinical distance. But this killer, the archivist, as social media was now calling him, seemed to understand not just murder, but the psychology of investigation itself. He understood how to be studied, how to remain ahead of profilers, how to turn the very act of investigation into part of his narrative. Adrian's phone buzzed. An encrypted message from an unknown number. "Dr. Cole, I've been studying your work for years. You understand violence better than most. I wonder if you'll understand yourself before it's too late." Adrian's blood ran cold. The killer had his number. More than that, the killer was initiating contact. And somewhere in the rational part of Adrian's mind, a voice whispered something dangerous. That part of him was curious to respond. 3 days into the investigation, Adrian's world had compressed into a singular point of focus: understanding the archivist. He worked 18-hour days, barely sleeping, consuming every detail of every case the killer had referenced. His hotel room in Denver became a secondary office, walls covered with photographs, timelines, and interconnected theories. Maya tried to pull him back to balance, to remind him to eat, to step outside, to maintain the professional boundaries that kept investigators sane. But Adrian was beyond hearing those warnings. The third body came on a Tuesday morning in Los Angeles. A woman named Jessica Park, murdered in a way that perfectly mirrored the case of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. The killer was escalating, choosing victims that represented different eras of American serial murder, different psychological profiles, different methodologies. It was almost like he was creating a taxonomy of violence, using real deaths to build some kind of perverse educational archive. But what disturbed Adrian most was the message left at the scene, addressed specifically to him. "Dr. Cole, you've spent your career trying to understand us. Aren't you curious about yourself?" Maya found Adrian in the FBI's Denver lab at 3 in the morning, surrounded by coffee cups and scattered papers. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with an expression that mixed professional concern with something deeper. She pulled out a chair and sat down. "My father was murdered when I was 14, Maya said quietly, her voice cutting through the fluorescent silence. "Never solved. I became an FBI agent because I needed to believe that understanding violence could prevent it, that if I was smart enough, dedicated enough, I could stop other families from experiencing what mine did." She paused, studying Adrian's face. "I'm telling you this because I see what's happening to you. I've seen it before. You're starting to believe that understanding the killer means becoming like the killer. That's the trap." Adrian looked at this woman, who had shared more vulnerability with him in one moment than she had in 5 years of partnership. "What if the trap is real?" he asked. "What if studying monsters really does change you? What if there's something in me that recognizes something in him? Then we find a way through it," Maya said firmly. "But not by disappearing into your own head, not by becoming what you're chasing." Over the next 48 hours, Adrian and Maya broke through the first real lead. By analyzing the victims' digital footprints, social media connections, and public records, they discovered something. All 3 victims had attended the same university, University of Colorado, Denver campus, roughly 15 years apart. All had taken a seminar on criminal psychology. All had attended lectures by a visiting professor named Dr. Michael Reeves. Adrian felt ice crystallize in his veins when he saw Reeves's photograph. The man had been a peer, someone Adrian had encountered at conferences, someone whose work on criminal cognition Adrian had actually cited in his own papers. Reeves had disappeared from academic circles roughly 5 years ago, reportedly due to mental health issues. His last known location was Denver. But what chilled Adrian most was recognizing something in Reeves's early publications, a perspective on violence, a way of analyzing killer psychology that was uncomfortably similar to Adrian's own, as if they had been looking at the same darkness from parallel angles, gradually spiraling deeper. That night, Adrian finally allowed himself to confront the question he'd been avoiding. What if his ability to understand killers came from something inside him that wasn't purely analytical? What if empathy for monsters was itself a warning sign? Maya, sitting across from him in the hotel restaurant, reached across the table and took his hand. It was a small gesture, but it grounded him in the present moment, in his own humanity. "You're not him," she said. "Understanding someone doesn't mean you are them. It means you're strong enough to look into darkness without letting it consume you." Adrian wasn't sure he believed that anymore, but he held on to her hand like it was the only thing tethering him to sanity. The confrontation came not in a dramatic final scene, but in a nondescript office building in downtown Denver on a gray afternoon. They had tracked Michael Reeves through digital financial records, an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet that kept active, careful movements through the dark web that suggested someone methodical and intelligent. Adrian and Maya, along with a tactical team, approached the location with weapons drawn, but also with a strange sense of inevitability. This had been building toward this moment since Adrian first saw that initial message. Reeves was waiting for them, sitting calmly in what appeared to be a private study, surrounded by thousands of documents, photographs, and recordings, the archive that had given him his nickname. He was 56, grey hair, intelligent eyes that held the peculiar quality of someone who had examined human darkness so thoroughly that he'd lost the ability to see anything else. "Dr. Cole," Reeves said, extending his hand in greeting as if they were meeting at a conference. "I've been waiting for you to understand." Adrian didn't take the hand. Instead, he stood in the doorway with Maya beside him, both of them locked in that moment of confrontation that separated investigators from the perpetrators they hunted. "You've been killing to make a point," Adrian said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his chest. "Each murder a reference, each victim a data point in some argument you're making about American culture and violence." "Not about culture," Reeves corrected calmly. "About people like us, people who understand violence so thoroughly that we exist partially outside normal human emotion. I recognized it in your work years ago, Adrian. You understand perpetrators because you contain perpetrators. We both do." "That's where you're wrong," Adrian said, but his voice wavered, because part of him, the part that had kept him awake for months, wondered if Reeves was right. Wondered if his ability to understand had somehow darkened him irreversibly. "Am I?" Reeves smiled. "Then why do you keep so much distance from normal relationships? Why can you only truly connect with people when examining trauma? Why does real violence fascinate you the way it does?" It was Maya who responded, stepping forward with her weapon drawn. "Because he's human enough to question himself," she said. "Because he's terrified of becoming you, which means he never will. You convinced yourself that understanding darkness made you special. It just made you broken in a way you rationalized as superior." What happened next unfolded with terrible speed. Reeves reached toward a switch on his desk, some kind of deadman mechanism designed to activate explosives already rigged throughout the building. But Adrian, driven by instinct and the weight of months of pursuit, moved faster. He crossed the space between them and prevented Reeves from completing the action. Not with violence, but with connection. Grabbing the man's hand, looking into his eyes, refusing to allow the archivist to control the narrative to the final moment. "I'm not you," Adrian said quietly, "and I never will be." Reeves was arrested. The building was secured. 23 victims were identified, real people whose murders had been meticulously documented in the archivist's collection. And Adrian, in the immediate aftermath, felt something shift inside himself. The fear didn't disappear. It would never fully disappear. But the fascination with darkness began to be replaced by something different, a commitment to understanding violence, not to be superior to it, but to prevent others from experiencing it. Weeks later, when Adrian had returned to Los Angeles and the case had become public, he found himself sitting in a coffee shop with Maya, neither of them discussing the investigation. Instead, they talked about recovery, about healing, about the careful work of maintaining your humanity when your profession required you to constantly examine inhumanity. "Thank you," Adrian said simply, "for pulling me back." Maya smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her that wasn't filtered through professional reserve. "That's what partners do," she said. "They remind you that you're not alone in the darkness." Adrian realized in that moment that the most important lesson wasn't about understanding criminals. It was about understanding himself and allowing others to help when the darkness got too deep. The United States in 2025 continued its obsession with true crime, but Adrian Cole was finally learning that understanding violence was valuable only if it led to genuine connection, genuine healing, genuine humanity. Everything else was just feeding the very darkness he'd spent his career trying to illuminate.